Hey everybody, this is Barry Johnson. Welcome back to another edition of Studio Talk. You know, technology is zipping past us at a flying lightning speed. What does that mean to us? And should we be paying attention? Let's get to it. Okay, so serious topic, something to really consider here. Um, Technology, in the way that we know it today, was really historically in the history of recording not a huge thing. In other words, companies were not coming out every other day with compelling products that really changed things just from the previous few years. That wasn't happening because we were all mainly in an analog world. Yes, every once in a while, somebody would come out with something and saying, holy crap, that sounds fantastic. But typically, was it revolutionary? Was it something that was going to save you a gazillion dollars? I would argue like when flying faders were first introduced to where you no longer had to do fader recalls and things like that, that saved a ton of time and obviously saved a ton of money. So that was a huge invention back in I think probably in the 70s to early 80s in there is probably when that started happening. And then of course, when digital audio kicked in, AKA Pro Tools for the first time, that's when people started transitioning over to this whole digital thing. Well, that process took the average person out there about 10 to 15 years before it started to be relatively adopted by your home project studio. I started out in digital back in the 90s in the very beginning of it. So I've always been an early adopter of technology. I've lived through all the growing pains, so I know how hard it can be. And trust me, it is light years better today than it was back in the early 2000s. Light years. And I mean, as far as, you'd be lucky if you could get a whole song recorded without having to have some kind of an error or something, at least for the longest time. So, that was challenging back then. And so, but you saw the advantage of it. Now, the advantages to digital back then were huge and significant, especially once plugins started getting fairly darn good. Okay. Because back in the day, if you wanted to have compression on, let's say, 12 particular sources in your mix, you'd have to own 12 different compressors, or you'd have to track applying that compression on the way in. That's not always a great idea. It depends, a light little touch, but the typical sculpting compression you're going to do typically in a mix. That's why you see all these studios, they have walls and walls of rack gear. Well, obviously, if I'm putting, 10 as an example, 10 compressors that are $2,000 each or $1,000 each, that's $10,000 compared to one plugin I could buy for a couple $100 and do as many as I want. So obviously that started to make things a lot lesser expensive and to be able to do more for less, to the point today you can have a total kick butt home recording system for several $1,000s invested. You know what I mean? You don't have to spend a ton. Is it going to be at the level of the major recording studios historically? No. Can you get pretty darn close? Yeah, if you learn your skill set and your talent. So, so the question becomes, how important is it today to stay on top of technology? I would argue if you got into this in the last 10 years, recently, I would say it's probably not been that big of a deal. You had UAD came in and really transformed things for a lot of people, especially when they adopted their Apollo units. And I've been critical of where UAD is today. But UAD made a huge, and I mean a freaking huge difference when they first came out, because you could track with DSP and things like that. And they were taking on the big guys like Avid as an example and doing it at a fraction of the cost. So yet here we're coming in again with new technology that's giving us so much more for our money. Again, do you think maybe it's wise to stay up to date on technology as it comes out? Because ultimately it can save you money as far as your workflow is concerned, or most of the time it can, or it can make life so much easier. And so you want to know that you're spending your money wisely. If there's any one thing I want to drive home a message on this channel is spend your money wisely. Don't waste money on things that are become obsolete in your workflow in just a year or so. Save up and spend a little bit more. So back to technology. So yes, we've seen some rapid advances come and go, and they seem to stagnate for a while historically. I would say up until the last year, I would say CPUs have gotten quite boring, especially on the Mac front. I don't think we've seen anything that has been groundbreaking in any way. The last thing was a new Mac Pro, but groundbreaking at the expense of 40 or 50 grand is not something I consider practical or reasonable for this guy. I'm just saying a little something. I don't have an extra 50 grand to swap down on a computer and wouldn't if I did. Okay. Because it starts to become completely impractical at that point. Okay. I'd go back to analog before I did that. So staying up to date on this stuff is important. Then you've got what Apple's come out with the new M1 processors. And really what that's mean more than anything else is your entry level person can get a boatload of freaking power now that they were never able to get before, in a way that we've never seen anything like that before. Yes. Are there some super top end things that could compete with it? Of course there are. It's, for the most part, at its introductory level, it's a mobile CPU. And so mobile CPUs, no, there's not a lot out there to compete with the M1 Max. Maybe one out there, and that's it. And it's a whole lot more expensive. So I think staying up to date on technology is important, because if you're smart about how you're handling your home studio, you're forward thinking in your strategy. Okay. I've got several videos out there, and I'll get some people comment, hey, if it's working for me, why do I got to worry about it? And I think to a lot of extent, there's a lot of truth to that. However, you don't want to get stuck so far behind that you have to completely reinvent the wheel every 5 to 7 years or so, investing in almost doubling your investment. Okay. Because the technology that quote unquote is working for you is out. Okay. Now, a lot of us aren't constantly spending money on our studios. Some of us are. I seem to be. But most people aren't, because a lot of people don't have the funds to do it. And it's just not practical. But staying on top of technology, I think, in my opinion, especially today, is super, super, super important. I think you need to know what's out there. I think you need to stay abreast of what's going on, whether or not you choose to invest in, or whether or not it makes sense to invest in it today or not, is irrelevant, quite frankly. You can at least see where things are going, so you don't make that mistake of buying a piece of gear that ultimately is going to be outdated in just a few short years. To some degree, we're always going to face that with computers. There's nothing we're ever going to be able to do about that. But I would even argue that your average project studio, if you buy your computer wisely, you should be able to get 5 to 7 years minimum out of that computer. Okay. That's been my experience the whole time I've been doing this. But that's all about speccing, building, or buying the right computer right out of the gate. Sometimes it may mean spending maybe another $1,000 to do something, but that ultimately will pay off in its longevity, because if you're buying $1,000 computer or building $1,000 computer, and then 3 years from now, you need to build another $1,000 computer. And then in a few years after that, so you got $3,000 into it, where if you spent $2,000 building a computer, you could have lasted that thing 5 to 7 years. So you get how this goes. So that's why it's important to stay up to date on it. Not obsessed with it, not obsessed with it, but stay on top of it and understand it. Guys like me will be obsessed with it for you, because that's just my DNA, and I actually eat this stuff up. All right. So I will share with you what I know, and there's tons of other resources out there once you have taken the time to learn the right YouTuber that you trust, because I'll be honest with you, I don't think you can trust the vast majority of them. Okay. But that's just my opinion. Those are lessons I've learned and times I've gotten burned. Hey, that's a new song, baby. I'm ready to ride on up, baby. Hey, where's my guitar? I got to put that to music, baby. Let's go. Okay. All right. Anyway. So think about that. I think it's important to stay up to date on technology. I think it's important to know where we're going with that. I think you need to keep a close eye on what Apple's doing. Even if you're a Windows user, I think it's important to keep a close eye on what Apple's doing, because they're kind of shaking the world up right now with this new change. Okay. Is it the greatest thing since sliced bread? No. But is it some of the best bread you ever had in your life? You better believe it, baby. But even you're on the Windows side, all that's doing is pushing. You're going to have this war, and this war is good for you and me. Okay. Intel trying to update Apple, I outdo Apple and versus AMD and all of these things is good for guys like you and me at home. But it's important that we know and we stay abreast, that we know going from that i7 to i9, is it really going to give me that much more or not? A perfect example of that would be in the new M1 Pro compared to the M1 Max. I've done some pretty exhaustive research and one-on-one experience with these things. And I'm going to tell you, I can't see justifying buying the M1 Max for audio. It doesn't, for audio or video, quite frankly. It's just only going to give you marginal improvements in the type of computing necessary to process that type of data. Okay. So why spend that extra money? That extra money could go towards more RAM or a bigger hard drive, which will yield you better mileage down the road. Okay. And so that's a prime example of where it doesn't make sense to go with the most and see. Okay. Now it's going to be interesting to see what Apple does coming out in 2022 with the M2s and what they're going to do with stacking those on top of each other in both the Mac Mini Pro, which is I'm excited to hear about, as well as what they're going to do with a little mini Mac Pro. I mean, that's all been talked about, as well as a killer iMac. I'm not an iMac kind of person because I prefer to have my own screen and that kind of stuff. If you can put it on a Versa mount, I might consider something like that. But anyway, those are killer systems coming up. And that's just on the Apple side of things. Okay. Bottom line is you can build a killer Windows machine to do this stuff too. So whether or not staying up to date on technology with processing, one of the main reasons why it's so important to stay up to date on technology for computer processing, especially today, is because we are finally at that point to where it's eliminating the need, and has, in my opinion, eliminated 100% the need for DSP ever again. Okay. There is no way in the world. I have tried desperately to choke my M1 Pro on my MacBook Pro. Okay. And I've not been able to do it. I can make it do it, of course, but when am I ever going to do hundreds and hundreds of virtual instruments and all this? I'm just not doing that. Okay. An average session for me is anywhere from 60 to 100 tracks. Okay. That's an average session for me. Okay. And so that thing can do it with the lowest buffer setting available in my sleep and never miss a beat, never have to worry about latency ever again. So that's another reason. Now, does that mean if you're already invested in a $3,000 to $20,000 DSP based system that you're just going to go off and dump that? Well, no, that doesn't make any sense. You'd be foolish to do that. Okay. Continue using what you're using right now, as long as it's working for you. But plan what your next step is going to be. And if you know what that next step is going to be, it will affect your purchasing decisions that you make going forward. So many of you don't stay up to date with it. You think that because it was relevant when you bought it, it's still relevant today. A perfect example of that is with the UAD platform. When it came out, it was absolutely relevant and groundbreaking and absolutely needed because computers still weren't there yet, okay? Well, the reality is they're finally there. As of 2021, we're there. We are there. The ship has landed, okay? It's set dock. Everybody's going out on excursions and having a grand old time, or at least those that know. The problem is there's not that many people on that ship because they don't know, because they're not paying attention. So don't think because that technology you invested in is just as needed today. Is it just as effective today? Well, of course it is, which is why I'd want you to continue using it. So let's use UAD and Avid as an example. If you're heavily into that DSP, why it's so important to pay attention now, right? Well, with UAD specifically, if you're starting to run out of horsepower for your plugins, you only have two choices, right? You buy either a satellite unit or you buy another Apollo, okay? Both of them are outrageously expensive, okay? And so to do that, if you spent that same money and upgraded your computer, could you possibly do even more and maybe use other plugins in place of some of those UAD plugins, because they've also gotten so good? It's also important to know that UAD is an example, and this is all a prime example of the subject of this, or the topic of this conversation. UAD's plugins were the king of the hill, the top of the line. And I mean, every single plugin they had was better, hands down, than everybody else. And that was the way for the longest time. It is not today. And so if you're in that world and you're still convinced and you think that that's the case today, I hate to break it to you, but it's not. Plugin manufacturers like Softtube, Plugin Alliance, and others are making some freaking insanely great sounding plugins, okay? As good and equivalent as many, if not most, of UAD plugins today, okay? They simply don't dominate, and the plugins where they do dominate, they're heavily resource dependent, which means basically you can't hardly use any of them, okay? Let's look at what Avid has done. Avid has finally realized that DSP is dead, okay? They too, like UAD, milked it for as long as they could, but they finally seen the light at the end of the tunnel and realized that technology, the way their old way of doing, it has to change. They started to change when they came out with the hybrid engine. Okay, before to run large sessions, you'd have to have probably 3 HDX cards to be able to run, because everything runs off those cards. Everything, not just the plugins, okay? You had to have all of that to do that. Today, even if you think you need DSP, and for some people they do, I'm not trying to say nobody needs it, okay? But for the ones that do actually still need some of it, okay, you only need one HDX card, because if you pair that with a powerful computer, the majority of that's going to run on the computer. And the only time you need that DSP is when you're tracking. It's the only time. Okay. Same reason the Carbon came out. It gets you over that hump, but it's short lived. Give that a few more years, and none of that's going to be needed by anybody. I'd say probably in 2022 that will be revealed. Okay. That's just my opinion. So these are examples to where, if you're living in the past and you're staying in the past, you have no idea what the future can do for you, and how, quite frankly, it can save you money if you're smart about it, okay? Now, if you want to live with your head buried in the sand and think that you can't work without what you have today because when you bought it, you couldn't, well, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you, okay? I'm all about spending your money wisely, because I would rather spend that wisely and buy more hardware, quite frankly, okay? I'd rather invest in more hardware that I know I can resell and it's going to retain most of its value. Whereas those plugins and those Apollos and everything else, those satellites and those HDX cards have drop. I mean, today you can buy a used HDX card for $2,000 easy, compared to $5,000 a few years ago. Okay. So I'm just telling you, think about these things. These are reasons, these are perfect examples of why it's important to at least stay up to date. Don't get all sucked into the hype of what you've bought into, okay? It can be great, but there's always going to be something better eventually. Always. That will never stop happening as long as we're using computers and plugins. Never, ever. So all I'm saying is embrace it. Embrace it. Stay up to date. Again, you don't need to be obsessive about it, but be open-minded about it, okay? So I know this is an interesting topic. It's probably not going to be one of my most watched videos, but should be, quite frankly. But I feel it's important to talk about this stuff. And this channel is about trying to help people. That's my goal. It's my objective. It's the only reason I do it. So I encourage you guys, leave some comments below. If you disagree with me, fine. Go down and disagree with me. Okay. But tell me, make an opinion. Don't argue with me. What's the point? You're not going to get anywhere with that. That's childish and nonsense. If you want, I have no problem jumping into a healthy debate back and forth in the comment section. Okay. Just know if I'm commenting, don't read into the tone of my text, because I'm having an intellectual conversation. Even if I'm debating you and you may think I'm arguing with you, I'm not. How in the world can we come to conclusions on things if we don't come at it from different perspectives and maybe win each other over throughout the process? Sometimes I get one over, and the other day it happened and I had to go, touche, you got the best of me on that one there, brah. Okay. And so I think that's fun and exciting. Okay. So I got a boatload of videos out there. Go watch some of them. Go check them all out. They're all kind of, meant to help you in your home project recording studio and give you things to think about. Okay. Whether or not they apply to you or not, only you can decide that. So hit that like button, that subscribe button, that notification. I think I've already done it, but I'm going to do it 2 times for the case of this, because I get long-winded and much of you don't like that. So anyway, until next time, I hope every one of you have a great day.